Gender matters in the atomic age. I was very honored to speak at the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impacts of Nuclear Weapons in December. And I'm even more pleased to be here today, and we're going to focus more broadly on gender and nuclear weapons. Thank you for this opportunity to speak, and thank you, all of you, for listening. My slides will be published online with citations and references. A nuclear explosion is composed of three types of energy: blast, heat, and radiation. All three have immediate and long-term medical consequences. Today I will focus on the long-term medical impacts of ionizing radiation. I urge you to visit the exhibit in the lobby now here at the UN, Cries from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to see the immediate medical impacts of the other types of energy. I use icons to track each type. Yellow is blast, red is thermal, orange is immediate gamma neutron radiation, and purple is the longer-lasting radioactivity from atomic fission products. Today, nuclear weapons are very much larger than in 1945, but the forces are the same. This photo was taken from the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It is a mistake to say that this photo is of the bomb. This cloud is what was, moments before, buildings, trees, homes, girls, boys, men, and women. A nuclear detonation is inherently indiscriminate. And this was the city of Nagasaki. I need to acknowledge the personal side of this. I rely on data that came from the studies of people who survived those bombs. My government chose to use the first nuclear weapons on cities full of people. 5 years later, the US initiated a long-term study of the atomic bomb survivors. Researchers assumed that humanitarian aid might skew the results of their study, so medical treatment was not offered by the researchers. This data is used widely, including by me here today. Speaking only as one woman, I need to say I'm very sorry. I deeply regret this history. Nagasaki, 1945, the church is in both frames. Today, the weapon that leveled Nagasaki would be considered tactical. Today's weapons are very much larger. The blast and heat destroyed structures and killed indiscriminately. Radiation levels at the epicenter were lethal. Only those with shielding survived. At least 150,000 men, women, and children died in 1945 from these two weapons, and probably around 250,000 over time. Radiation is invisible, but we can see the damage it has done to these chromosomes. Children's bodies are small, so the same amount of radiation delivers a larger dose. Since children are growing, the cells in their bodies are dividing more rapidly. DNA is more likely to be damaged in cell division. Cancer is the most studied long-term consequence of non-lethal radiation exposure. When genetic material inside a cell is damaged, sometimes our bodies can repair that damage. Otherwise, the abnormal cell may sit quietly in the body for years, even decades, before it makes us sick. There is no way to predict which exposure will result in cancer. In general, more radiation equals more cancer risk. However, an exposure too small to measure could sometimes result in cancer death. Regulatory agencies acknowledge there is no safe dose of ionizing radiation. Radiation is not safe for males, but new findings show that ionizing radiation is more harmful for females. There is a gender factor. Field and lab studies show that plants, insects, and animals are harmed by ionizing radiation, including natural background radiation. In 1942, our species began splitting atoms, resulting in massive new radioactivity that is impacting all of life. This is a very famous report, The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, number 7, also called Beer 7. The data is primarily from 93,000 survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the largest data set, which includes all ages and both genders. Beer 7 was published in 2006 after the youngest of the A-bomb survivors turned 60. Hence, it is also called the Lifespan Study. And it is the source for the data of the findings I will present now. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were grouped by the age they were at the time of the bombing. These groups were tracked over their lifetimes. Cancers and cancer deaths were counted. There are many problems with this data, but we can broadly say that those who were 5 years or younger in August 1945 had the most cancer at some point in their lives. Girls in this group were twice as likely. Girls in this group were twice as likely to get cancer at some point than were boys. For every male in the 0 to 5 year cohort that suffered cancer at some point in his life, 2 females got cancer. The Beer 7 report is where these numbers are found. The report itself does not discuss why gender is a risk factor. I published my findings in 2011. Independent from my work, Dr. Arjun Makajani published the same findings in 2006. Here is the same information in graphical form. The pink line is girls, the blue line is boys. We can easily see the gender difference and that it is greatest in young children. The entire graph is a snapshot of our species' cancer response to acute radiation exposure. It's extremely important to understand that little girls are not a subpopulation. We are an inextricable link in the human life cycle. Gender was also a factor for those who were adults at the time of the bombings. Over their lifetime, women exposed as adults suffered 50% more cancer death than did men in the same group. For every 2 men in these cohorts who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. Why is gender a risk factor for cancer due to harm from radiation? Today, we do not know. Dr. Rosalie Bertel suggested that maybe it was because female bodies have more sensitive reproductive cells. Maybe it's the percentage of fatty tissue. Maybe it's endocrine differences. These questions have not yet been asked, let alone answered. It took 60 years to see this gender difference. On this slide, the green circle is the reference man, corresponding to an adult male military or paramilitary atomic worker of the 1940s or 1950s. The rest of the slide I made gray because decision makers have not seen information about males of other ages or any information about females until very recently. We have been invisible. In order to ensure the viability of our species over time, radiation regulations must promote and protect the entire life cycle. They should be centered on the most radiosensitive phase, which is girls 0 to 5 on this graph, where I've put the big X. This approach is not happening. It is not even being discussed in regulatory agencies. The APOM survivor data is incomplete. The studies and data collection began in 1950, 5 years after the bombs. Many who survived the initial blasts then died in the next few years. These deaths are not part of the data set. As a result, the group that was studied is strong, stronger than a typical human population. The epicenter of an atomic blast gets one fast pulse of gamma rays and neutrons. The source is external to the body, like X-rays in the left side of the slide. The fallout traveled away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Internal exposures were not included in this lifespan study. Fission products like cesium, strontium, and plutonium contaminate air, food, and water, getting inside our bodies. Internal radioactivity is very different. The right photo is of a bit of plutonium in lung tissue. The black areas are dead cells, due to very high local radiation exposures at close range. This is very different from an X-ray. More than 2,000 nuclear explosions have already occurred on our planet, and it is already contaminated, even without waging a full-scale nuclear war. We can see the radioactivity in our environment shows up in samples of living tissue. This is known as the body burden. We do not know if gender is a factor in the risk of harm from internal radiation sources. Fission also happens at 390 nuclear reactors worldwide. Each red dot is a nuclear reactor. Each of these sites splits as many atoms in 1 year as 1,100 A-bombs. Already, major reactor accidents contaminate large areas of land, water, and air. Chernobyl is on the left with a large scale of Europe, and Fukushima is a local scale on the right. This picture shows 3 generations: the mother, the growing fetus, and the primary germ cells for the next generation are there too. The egg you came from was formed inside your maternal grandmother. Your father's spermatogonia were formed inside your paternal grandmother. The primary germ cells form an unbroken chain back to the beginning of our species. Dr. Alice Stewart called childhood cancer a post-birth defect. Radiation impacts our cells. When the reproductive cells are harmed, deformations are one outcome. This happens to all babies, plants, animals, humans. We also suffer loss of fertility, spontaneous abortion and miscarriage, possible heritable mutations, avoidance of reproduction due to uncertainty. While reducing reproductive rate of our species may be a good thing, these issues have to do with our long-term capacity to reproduce at all. Fission results in massive release of ionizing radiation. Earth's biosphere is being challenged in ways we cannot foretell. And finally, this is a picture of health. These women recently stopped a nuclear waste dump from coming to their people's traditional lands. Radiation prevention is more than avoiding harm. It is a source of health and empowerment. In Vienna, I said these words in a new way. Prevention is the cure. And the future is in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.